My husband laughed when he saw her standing alone in court. That is how this case begins. Not with shouting, not with chaos, but with confidence, misplaced confidence, and a laugh that carried years of certainty behind it. I'm attorney Claire Morgan. I've handled many family court cases, but this one stayed with me because it revealed something people rarely recognize in time: how easily calm behavior is mistaken for truth, and how silence is often used as evidence against the very person it was forced upon. If you believe real stories matter, subscribe and stay with me until the end. Because what looks like an ordinary marital dispute often hides a much deeper kind of damage. When she walked into my office for the first time, she didn't look angry. She looked careful. Her hands were steady, but her posture suggested someone who had spent years preparing for the wrong reactions. She spoke softly, choosing her words the way people do when they're used to being misunderstood. She wasn't there to destroy anyone. She was there because she was tired of disappearing. Her marriage, on the surface, had always looked stable. Her husband was respected, well-spoken, calm under pressure, the kind of man people trust quickly. She, on the other hand, had been labeled emotional. That word followed her everywhere. In the early years of the marriage, disagreements were brushed aside with laughter. When she expressed discomfort, he told her she was too sensitive. When she asked for boundaries, he framed them as unnecessary drama. None of it sounded alarming on its own. That's what made it effective. Over time, laughter replaced discussion. Dismissal replaced resolution. And gradually she stopped speaking, not because she had nothing to say, but because speaking always seemed to make things worse. His family played a quiet but powerful role. They never shouted at her, they never openly accused her. Instead, they corrected her tone, advised her patience, questioned her reactions. If she stayed quiet, she was cold. If she spoke up, she was difficult. There was no safe position. What struck me most as she spoke was not what she described, but how she described it. She doubted herself constantly. She replayed conversations, questioning her own memory. She apologized instinctively, even while explaining how she'd been hurt. She had learned to preempt blame. That doesn't happen overnight. It happens when someone is slowly taught that their perception cannot be trusted. By the time the marriage began to unravel, the narrative was already set. He told people she was unstable, overwhelmed, unable to cope. And because she had spent years trying to stay calm, polite, and agreeable, his version sounded believable. When the case reached court, he arrived prepared with a lawyer, with family support, with confidence. She arrived alone. Not because she wanted sympathy, but because every legal consultation she sought ended the same way. Without proof, this will be difficult. What those lawyers didn't know was that she had spent years surviving in silence. And silence teaches observation. She had messages saved, dates written down, voice notes preserved, not out of revenge, but because she no longer trusted her memory after being told for so long that she imagined things. When she decided to represent herself, people warned her. They said she would be emotional, that she would undermine her own case. That court was not the place for feelings. But this case was not built on feelings. It was built on patterns. The morning of the hearing, as she stood in court holding her file, her husband laughed. That laugh said everything. He believed the version of her he had spent years creating would speak louder than any evidence she carried. What he didn't realize, what no one realized yet, was that this was the first time she was speaking in a room where interruption wasn't allowed. And that changed everything. Cases like this rarely fall apart all at once. They erode. What stood out to me as this woman continued telling her story was not a single explosive incident, but a long, deliberate process that slowly narrowed her world. By the time the marriage officially ended, she was already living inside a version of reality that had been shaped for her. After the separation, most people expected distance to bring relief. It didn't. It brought exposure. Without the structure of marriage, her husband no longer needed to maintain the appearance of compromise. His involvement in her life didn't stop. It simply became quieter, more strategic, and easier to disguise as concern. He checked in often, asked questions that sounded supportive, offered advice she hadn't requested, and every time she resisted, the same narrative returned. He worried about her stability, her decisions, her emotional state. Concern, when repeated often enough, can sound like truth, especially to outsiders. What followed was not harassment in the obvious sense. It was something more difficult to explain. He positioned himself as the reasonable one. If she set boundaries, he framed them as hostility. If she asked for space, he framed it as avoidance. If she disagreed, he framed it as instability. The effect was subtle but powerful. People stopped asking her how she felt. They asked why she was reacting the way she was. That shift matters. Because once someone is viewed as emotionally unreliable, their experiences stop being examined and start being explained away. Her support system weakened quietly. Friends grew uncomfortable. Family conversations became cautious. Advice replaced empathy. She was no longer someone who needed understanding. She was someone who needed managing. This is where many victims begin to disappear completely. She almost did. There were days she questioned her own decision to leave. Days when loneliness felt heavier than the marriage ever had. Days when doubt returned so forcefully that she wondered whether staying silent had been easier after all. What saved her wasn't strength, it was awareness. She began noticing patterns she had previously dismissed. The timing of his messages, the way he escalated pressure when she asserted independence, the way calmness disappeared the moment he wasn't in control. For the first time, she stopped interpreting his behavior through hope. She observed it through consistency, and consistency told a story that words never had. This was when she began documenting deliberately, not obsessively, not emotionally, methodically. She saved messages without responding to them, recorded voice notes when conversations shifted into manipulation, wrote down dates and contexts immediately after interactions, not to punish him, but to protect herself from doubt. One of the most damaging effects of long-term emotional manipulation is the loss of trust in one's own memory. She knew that if she didn't preserve reality somewhere outside herself, it would continue slipping away. As legal proceedings became inevitable, the pressure intensified. He hired a lawyer quickly, an experienced one, confident, articulate. Prepared, to an outsider the contrast was striking. On one side, a man with representation, family support, and composure. On the other, a woman whose calm had been mistaken for weakness for years. She was advised repeatedly to secure legal counsel, and she tried, but each consultation followed a similar pattern. They listened politely, nodded sympathetically, then asked the same question. "Do you have proof?" Without proof, they warned her, credibility would be an issue. Without proof, emotions could work against her. They weren't wrong, but they were incomplete. What they didn't understand was that her entire survival strategy had depended on awareness. She had lived inside this dynamic long enough to recognize its structure, and she had documented it. The decision to represent herself did not come from confidence. It came from clarity. She understood the risks. She understood the assumptions. She understood how she would be perceived. But she also understood something else. No one knew this story as precisely as she did. No one else could speak about the small details that revealed the larger truth, the pauses, the patterns, the gradual tightening of control. As the court date approached, the warnings intensified. She was told she would appear emotional, that she would struggle under questioning, that representing herself would be seen as reckless. What no one recognized was that she had already spent years defending herself, just not in a courtroom. She had defended her perceptions, her reactions, her sanity. Court to her was not unfamiliar pressure. It was a formal version of something she had survived informally for a very long time. The night before the hearing, she didn't sleep. Not because she was afraid of losing, but because she was preparing for something she had never experienced before. Being listened to without interruption, being questioned without mockery, being evaluated on facts rather than tone. That morning when she walked into the courtroom holding her file, she didn't look confident. She looked composed. Her husband did not recognize the difference. He still believed this case would follow the pattern of their marriage. He would speak calmly, she would react emotionally, and everyone would decide accordingly. That belief is what made him careless. And carelessness in cases like this is often the first crack in control. Courtrooms reward structure. They favor clarity, consistency, and restraint. They do not reward emotional explanation, especially from someone who has already been labeled as unreliable. That reality worked in her husband's favor. At least that's what he believed. When proceedings began, he appeared exactly as expected, composed, confident, and prepared. His lawyer spoke smoothly, presenting him as cooperative, patient, and concerned. The narrative was simple. He was a man trying to move forward. She was a woman struggling to let go. And for a brief moment, the room leaned in that direction. She, meanwhile, stood alone, no legal language to shield her. No professional buffer to reframe her emotions, only facts and the discipline it took to deliver them without defending her character. That restraint was deliberate. She understood something many self-represented litigants do not. Court is not the place to prove pain, it is the place to demonstrate patterns. When the judge asked her why she had chosen to represent herself, her answer was not emotional, it was practical. She stated that she had tried to secure counsel, but that her case relied heavily on context, consistency, and documentation, elements she was uniquely positioned to present accurately. That answer mattered. It signaled preparation rather than impulse. Still, skepticism lingered. Her husband's confidence remained intact. He smiled occasionally, shifted comfortably in his seat, assumed familiarity would work in his favor. This was not the first time he had underestimated her readiness. What followed was subtle but important. As she began presenting her timeline, she did not argue. She listed dates, summarized events, referenced communications. Each point was delivered without commentary. No accusations, no emotional language, just sequence. At first it seemed unimpressive, but gradually something changed. The judge began asking questions not of her, but about the consistency of the information presented. The court reviewed saved messages. Individually they appeared ordinary, collectively they revealed something else. A repeated pattern of dismissal, deflection, control masked as concern. Her husband's lawyer objected occasionally, not forcefully but routinely, attempting to limit interpretation. But objections cannot erase timelines. And timelines, once established, are difficult to undo. What became increasingly clear was that this was not a case built on isolated conflict. It was a case built on repetition. When her husband took the stand, his confidence returned. He framed his behavior as misunderstood, his involvement as concern, his comments as jokes taken too seriously, and again this approach nearly worked, until one detail disrupted the narrative. He denied remembering certain communications, not aggressively, casually. He claimed they had been exaggerated. That was the moment his composure began to fracture, because memory is a dangerous thing to rely on when someone else has records. She presented saved messages, not dramatically, methodically. Each message corresponded precisely with dates he had dismissed. Each message contradicted the image he was presenting. The shift in the courtroom was not immediate, but it was unmistakable. Confidence relies on control, and control relies on predictability. This situation was no longer predictable. The judge's questions grew more specific. Less about her reactions, more about his consistency. He adjusted his posture. His answers grew longer, explanations replaced certainty. What had once been calm now appeared rehearsed. And rehearsed narratives unravel when confronted with documentation. The most striking moment was not a confrontation. It was a pause. A pause after a message was read aloud. A pause that lingered long enough to disrupt momentum. Silence in court carries weight, and in that silence something shifted. For the first time, her husband was no longer the most credible voice in the room, not because he was exposed as cruel, but because he was revealed as inconsistent. And inconsistency is something courts understand very well. She remained composed throughout, not triumphant, not emotional, focused. She had spent years being told her reactions defined her. Now her restraint was doing the opposite. By the time the session adjourned, the power dynamic had changed, not dramatically, but permanently. What began as confidence had turned into caution, and caution in cases like this signals awareness. Her husband left that courtroom no longer certain, and she left knowing something crucial. She had not needed to convince anyone of her pain, she only needed to present the truth long enough for it to speak for itself. Every case has a moment when the direction becomes irreversible. Not dramatic, not loud, irreversible. In this case, that moment arrived quietly, wrapped inside a decision she had made long before she ever stepped into a courtroom. When people hear the word recording, they imagine something impulsive, a secret act done in anger or desperation. That wasn't what happened here. This recording was not created to win a case. It was created because she had reached a point where memory was no longer safe. Long before separation, long before legal filings, she had begun to notice something disturbing. Arguments didn't just end, they were rewrit. Conversations didn't just fade, they were denied. Promises were not broken, they were never acknowledged. And each time she tried to recall what had been said, she was told she was confused, emotional, imagining tone where none existed. Over time, that does something dangerous. It teaches a person to distrust their own perception. That was the moment she understood she needed something external, something that could not be argued with, reframed, or laughed away. The recording happened on an ordinary evening. No shouting, no threats, just his voice, calm, controlled, and unmistakably revealing. When she recorded it, she did not listen to it right away. Not because she was afraid, but because she already knew what it contained. She kept it because she needed proof that what she experienced was real, for herself first, for anyone else later. By the time the court proceedings reached the stage where evidence could be formally introduced, she had debated whether to use it at all. Recordings change cases, but they also change perceptions. She understood that once it was played, there would be no way back to neutrality, no way to soften interpretation. And still, she chose to proceed, not out of anger, out of finality. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was different. Her husband was no longer relaxed. His lawyer had become cautious. The judge, having reviewed timelines and documentation, was no longer focused on her emotional state, but on behavioral consistency. This mattered. When she indicated that she had one final piece of evidence, the room shifted. Her husband's lawyer requested clarification. She stated calmly that it was an audio recording, captured during a private interaction, and that it directly related to the behavioral patterns already discussed. There was an objection, standard, expected, arguments about context, about legality, about interpretation, but the foundation had already been laid. This recording did not stand alone, it completed a pattern. The judge allowed it. What followed was not dramatic. There were no gasps, no raised voices, just sound, his voice, steady, dismissive, calculated. He spoke to her the way someone does when they are certain they hold authority, not angry, not emotional, certain. As the recording played, something subtle but devastating occurred. The tone he had denied emerged clearly. The control he had reframed as concern became unmistakable. The dismissal he had laughed off settled heavily in the room. This was not a man losing his temper. This was a man comfortable exercising power. That distinction is crucial. When the recording ended, there was silence, not confusion, recognition. Her husband did not look at her. He looked at his lawyer. His lawyer did not respond immediately. Because recordings do not argue, they do not exaggerate, they do not forget. The judge asked a single question, not about her behavior, not about her reactions, about his intent. That question changed everything. For the first time, her husband struggled to answer without circling back to explanations that no longer fit. Concern no longer sounded gentle. Calm no longer sounded reasonable. It sounded strategic. What collapsed in that moment was not just his credibility. It was the narrative he had relied on for years. The idea that she was unstable, that she misunderstood him, that her emotions distorted reality. Because the recording required no emotional interpretation, it simply existed. She remained still, no reaction, no satisfaction. She had already processed this moment long before it happened. What mattered now was not how she felt. It was what could no longer be denied. The judge did not rule immediately. Judges rarely do when something significant has shifted, but the tone had changed. Questions became precise. Explanations were no longer accepted without scrutiny. Her husband's confidence did not return. Once certainty fractures, it does not easily reform. As the session concluded, it was clear to everyone present that this case was no longer about a disagreement between two spouses. It was about control, and control, once exposed, does not survive well under examination. She left the courtroom that day unchanged on the outside, but something fundamental had occurred. For the first time, the truth had been heard without interruption, and for the first time, the room had believed it. When control is exposed, it does not disappear, it adapts. That was the most important shift I observed after the recording was played in court. The case did not become easier for her, it became more complicated. Her husband did not react with outrage. He reacted with strategy. The days following that hearing were not loud or confrontational. They were quiet and carefully constructed. What he lost in credibility inside the courtroom, he attempted to regain outside of it. The narrative changed. He was no longer defending himself against accusations. He was now positioning himself as the victim of misinterpretation. The recording, his lawyer argued, had been taken out of context. His tone, they suggested, was firm but not abusive. His words, they claimed, reflected frustration rather than control. This is a familiar tactic. When behavior can no longer be denied, intent becomes the battleground. He framed himself as misunderstood, as provoked, as reacting to her emotional instability. And because this explanation was delivered calmly and repeatedly, it found space to breathe. People want explanations that restore balance. They do not like outcomes that feel morally uncomfortable. What mattered most, however, was not how the recording was debated in court, but how pressure intensified around her afterward. Communication resumed, not directly, indirectly. Messages arrived through family members. Friends expressed concern. Advice began circulating again. She was urged to settle, to move on, to avoid dragging things further. The language was gentle, but the message was clear. Silence would be rewarded, persistence would not. This is where many cases collapse, not because evidence disappears, but because the emotional cost of continuing becomes unbearable. She was tired. The process had stripped her routine, her privacy, and her sense of safety. Every decision was scrutinized, every reaction felt amplified. And yet what struck me most was not her exhaustion, it was her discipline. She did not respond impulsively. She did not engage in side arguments. She documented everything. Pressure leaves traces, and she understood that. Her husband's behavior shifted again, not in tone but in presentation. He became excessively reasonable, overly cooperative, publicly respectful. This was not growth, it was performance. Inside court, this approach created confusion. Judges are trained to evaluate evidence, but they are also human. When someone appears conciliatory, it invites doubt about earlier impressions. This was his goal, to soften what had hardened, to blur what had become clear. But patterns do not vanish simply because behavior adjusts temporarily. The judge noticed something important. The shift in his demeanor occurred only after exposure. Only after documentation. Only after accountability became possible. That timing mattered. Meanwhile, the emotional toll on her continued to rise. Being believed does not immediately restore peace. It often invites scrutiny. She questioned herself again, not because she doubted the truth, but because she was confronting the reality of how much it had cost to preserve it. Isolation returned, not imposed, but chosen. She withdrew from conversations that drained her. She limited interactions that reopened wounds. She focused only on what was necessary. This restraint was misinterpreted. Some viewed it as coldness, others as stubbornness. Very few recognized it as survival. In preparation for the next hearing, attempts were made to undermine her credibility indirectly. Her reactions were questioned. Her motivations were speculated about. Her mental state was subtly referenced. Nothing overt, nothing provable on its own, but consistent. The goal was not to disprove evidence, it was to reintroduce doubt. Doubt does not need to win, it only needs to exist. What stopped this strategy from succeeding was something simple. She did not change her behavior to counter it. She remained consistent. Consistency is difficult to argue against. She arrived prepared, responded directly. Avoided commentary. Her husband, on the other hand, continued adjusting. An adjustment, when repeated, reveals insecurity. As the court reviewed follow-up submissions, a subtle shift occurred again. The judge's focus narrowed. Less on interpretation, more on conduct over time, less on explanation, more on response to accountability. This is where cases often turn quietly, not in one ruling, but in accumulated observation. Her husband's attempt to appear cooperative began to conflict with documented patterns. His explanations became longer, his framing more complex. Complexity often signals evasion. The final moment of this phase did not happen in court. It happened when communication ceased entirely. After realizing that indirect pressure no longer influenced her decisions, contact stopped, not out of respect, out of recognition. He had exhausted that avenue. What remained was the process itself. And process, unlike perception, does not bend easily. She reached a point where fear no longer drove her actions. Fatigue did, but fatigue can coexist with resolve. And resolve, once formed without anger, is difficult to break. By the end of this stage, it was clear that the case had moved beyond personal conflict. It was now a question of accountability, not emotional accountability. Structural accountability, and those are not decided by persuasion but by record. By the time the case reached its final phase, something important had changed. There was no longer a sense of argument. There was assessment. This distinction matters. Arguments rely on persuasion. Assessment relies on accumulation. The court was no longer deciding which story sounded more reasonable. It was examining which version of events had remained consistent under pressure. And consistency, over time, has a way of revealing more than intention ever could. In the final hearings, the pace slowed. Questions were fewer but more precise. Statements were shorter but more consequential. The judge no longer focused on how either party described themselves. The focus had shifted to behavior, sustained, documented, and contextualized. This is where many people misunderstand court outcomes. They expect a dramatic turning point. In reality, decisions often become inevitable long before they are announced. Her husband entered this phase differently than before. He was no longer confident. He was careful. That change alone spoke volumes. Carefulness can indicate growth, but in this case, it indicated awareness. Awareness that previous strategies no longer worked. Awareness that his credibility had become conditional. His legal team adjusted accordingly. They stopped attempting to explain the past. They focused instead on minimizing impact. This is another common shift. When denial fails, relevance is challenged. They argued that even if certain behaviors were inappropriate, they were not decisive. That intent mattered, that interpretation varied. But this approach struggled under scrutiny because the court was no longer evaluating isolated incidents. It was evaluating response to accountability. The judge examined how behavior changed once it was documented, how explanations evolved, how responsibility was framed, and more importantly, how it was avoided. Throughout this phase, she remained consistent, not passive. Consistent, she did not expand her claims, she did not embellish details, she did not react to provocation. She answered what was asked. She referenced what was documented. She allowed the record to speak where words were unnecessary. This discipline is rare, especially after prolonged emotional strain. What many people fail to understand is that by the time a person reaches this level of composure, they are not detached. They are resolved. Resolution does not look like confidence. It looks like restraint. There were moments during these hearings where the imbalance of power resurfaced briefly, not overtly, but subtly. A tone shift, a dismissive phrasing, a return to familiar framing. And each time the judge noted it, not verbally, procedurally. Questions were redirected, clarifications were requested, assumptions were challenged. This is how authority asserts itself in court, not through reprimand but through structure. Her husband struggled most during moments of neutrality, when no one argued with him, when no one accused him. He was asked to explain choices, not defend them, and explanation requires coherence. That coherence weakened. What had once been presented as concern now appeared conditional. What had once been framed as misunderstanding now appeared repetitive. What had once been described as mutual conflict now appeared asymmetrical. None of this was stated explicitly, but it was visible. The judge's language changed. Less hypothetical, more definitive. This is often how inevitability enters a case. Quietly, meanwhile, the emotional cost on her intensified. Final phases are not relieving, they are draining. Hope becomes cautious. Relief feels premature. She had spent so long bracing for disbelief that the absence of resistance felt unsettling. She questioned whether something was still coming, whether the ground would shift again. That vigilance is common among people who have spent years in unstable dynamics. Stability feels unfamiliar. But the process continued steadily, methodically. When closing submissions were made, they lacked urgency. Urgency suggests doubt. What remained was assessment. Her husband's narrative no longer dominated space. It was contained. Her documentation was no longer questioned. It was referenced. The court was not moved by emotion. It was moved by alignment. alignment between timeline and behavior, alignment between response and accountability, alignment between words and actions over time. This is the point where outcomes become clear even if they are not yet spoken. By the end of the final hearing, there was no confrontation, no dramatic exchange, just procedure. And procedure, when allowed to run its course, rarely favors control. As she left the courtroom that day, there was no celebration. No visible relief, only exhaustion and something else, finality, not because the decision had been announced, but because nothing remained unresolved. The case no longer belonged to interpretation. It belonged to record. And records do not bend under pressure, they wait. Judgments are rarely delivered the way people imagine. There is no dramatic pause, no raised voice, no moment that feels cinematic. There is only language, measured, deliberate, final. When the court reconvened to deliver its decision, the atmosphere was restrained. The emotional energy that once filled the room had been replaced by quiet anticipation, not tension, but acceptance. Both parties were present. Her husband sat upright, composed, his expression controlled but no longer confident. What remained was caution, the kind that comes when a person senses an outcome they cannot redirect. She sat still, not anxious, not hopeful, still. By this point, expectation had been replaced by endurance. She had learned not to anticipate relief. She had learned that waiting for certainty was safer than reaching for it. The judge began by summarizing, not the conflict. Not the accusations, the process. Timelines were referenced, documentation acknowledged, behavioral patterns outlined. This mattered more than the conclusion itself, because it confirmed something crucial. The court had not seen this as a single disagreement. It had seen it as sustained conduct. The judge addressed credibility not by labeling either party, but by explaining how consistency, documentation, and response to accountability had been evaluated. This is where cases like this quietly end, not with condemnation, but with clarity. The ruling did not need to state that control existed. It demonstrated that it had been recognized. The decision favored her not emotionally but structurally. Her claims were validated within the framework that mattered most. The court acknowledged imbalance. It acknowledged pattern. It acknowledged impact. Her husband did not react immediately. There was no visible anger, no disbelief, just stillness. The kind that follows the loss of narrative control. What had been taken from him was not reputation, it was authority over interpretation. And that loss is profound. For her, the moment did not feel victorious. It felt disorienting. Years of anticipation had trained her to brace for dismissal. The absence of it created a strange emotional vacuum. Being believed does not instantly restore peace. It initiates something else, reckoning. In the days that followed, reactions emerged not from the court but from the world outside it. Some people were supportive, some were silent, others struggled. Not because they doubted the outcome, but because it forced them to reevaluate their assumptions. People who had once advised patience now avoided the topic. People who had dismissed her concerns reframed their memory of events. This is another cost of truth. It unsettles observers. Her husband's response remained controlled. He did not lash out, he did not apologize. He withdrew. Withdrawal is common when accountability becomes unavoidable. There were no further attempts to explain, no reframing. The absence of engagement signaled recognition. The case, as far as he was concerned, had reached its limit. For her, the emotional consequences unfolded slowly. There was relief, but it was distant. There was validation, but it did not erase exhaustion. She had spent years in a state of vigilance. That does not disappear with a ruling. She questioned herself again, not about the truth, but about what came next. Who was she now that she no longer had to defend her reality? That question lingered. She experienced moments of grief, not for the marriage, but for the version of herself that had survived it. She mourned the time lost to doubt, the energy spent managing perceptions, the silence she had learned to live inside. And yet, something had shifted fundamentally. She no longer needed to prove anything. The record existed, not just legally. Internally, that matters, because the most enduring damage in cases like this is not the conflict itself, it is the internalization of disbelief. That internalization had been interrupted. As a lawyer, I often see people assume that winning a case brings closure. It doesn't. Closure is not delivered by courts. It is built afterwards slowly, deliberately, and privately. She began distancing herself from environments that demanded explanation. She stopped correcting narratives that no longer mattered. Her focus shifted, not toward rebuilding relationships, but toward rebuilding trust in herself. This process was quiet, invisible to most, but profound. By the time she returned for final administrative proceedings, there was no tension, just formality. The case that once consumed her had become contained. It had boundaries now. And boundaries, for someone who had lived without them, were transformative. She walked away not empowered in the way people imagine. She walked away unburdened. That distinction matters. Power suggests force. Unburdening suggests release. The truth had not elevated her. It had returned her to herself. Cases do not end when courtrooms empty. They end much later, in quieter places, in ordinary moments, in the slow reconstruction of a life that no longer revolves around survival. Long after the judgment was delivered, this case stayed with me, not because of the ruling itself, but because of what followed it. When the legal process concluded, there were no dramatic changes overnight, no sudden sense of freedom, no immediate peace. What came instead was space. And for someone who has lived under constant evaluation, space can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling. She no longer woke up anticipating conflict. She no longer prepared explanations in advance. She no longer replayed conversations to check whether she had said something wrong. At first, the absence of those habits felt like loss. Then it felt like relief. This is something few people talk about. When control ends, the nervous system does not immediately understand that it is safe. Silence can feel empty rather than calm. Freedom can feel directionless rather than empowering. But slowly, without pressure or expectation, something important began to return: trust, not in others, in herself. She began making decisions without rehearsing them, expressing opinions without softening them, saying no without justification. These were small acts, almost invisible from the outside, but they marked profound internal change. There were still moments of grief. Not for the marriage itself, but for the years spent doubting her own perception. That grief did not disappear. It integrated. She learned to hold it without letting it define her. From a legal perspective, this case was resolved clearly. From a human perspective, it illustrated something far more complex. Control does not always look like cruelty. Abuse does not always announce itself with violence. And credibility is often assigned to those who speak calmly, not to those who speak truthfully. This case mattered because it disrupted those assumptions. It demonstrated that emotional restraint is not the absence of harm. That consistency matters more than charm. That documentation protects those whose voices have been minimized. But most importantly, it showed that silence does not equal weakness. Often, it is a survival strategy. For her husband, life continued. There were no public consequences, no dramatic fallout. And that, too, is something people misunderstand. Justice does not always punish. Sometimes it simply removes power. He no longer controlled the narrative. He no longer defined her reality. He no longer occupied the space he once did. And that loss, though quiet, was complete. For her, the future was not dramatic, it was stable. She rebuilt routines, established boundaries, chose environments that did not require self-defense. Over time, she stopped thinking of the case as something that happened to her. It became something she survived. And survival, when acknowledged, becomes strength, not the loud kind, but the enduring kind. As a lawyer, I am often asked what makes a case memorable. It is not the evidence alone. It is not the ruling. It is the moment someone realizes they are no longer asking to be believed. They are standing in their truth, calmly, firmly, without apology. This case serves as a reminder. To those watching, listening, and recognizing pieces of their own lives in this story, you are not weak for staying. You are not foolish for doubting yourself. And you are not wrong for needing proof of your own reality. Silence does not erase truth. Time does not invalidate harm. And clarity once reached cannot be taken away. This story did not end with revenge. It ended with release. And sometimes that is the most powerful outcome of all. This case is closed. If this story resonated with you, remember, control thrives in silence, but truth survives it. Thank you for staying until the end.